Hi, we're in section 5.3 in the cardiovascular system, talking about the heart and the blood vessels. In this lecture, we're going to be specifically talking about the heart, and the title here says the heart is a double pump. And really, when we're talking about that double pump, we're talking about pumping the blood to the lungs and back, and pumping the blood to circulate throughout the body. Most of us are familiar with the whole idea of putting your hand on your heart. We put it on the left side of our body, but it turns out your heart is right in the middle of your sternum, which is the bone right here in the center. But the reason why you feel it beating a little bit more on the left side of your chest is because the heart is tilted to the left. So the part that's beats the strongest is kind of tilting in that direction. And so a lot of people are thinking that their heart's over on the left side. Here's a vocabulary word. It talks about the major portion of the heart is called the myocardium. Myo refers to muscle and cardium refers to the heart. And so when you look at the heart itself, most of what you're looking at is heart muscle. So we call this tissue the myocardium. There's a nicely labeled diagram here that you can look at in your book. And a couple other parts of the heart. So what happens when we're learning about the parts of the heart, generally you take a what we call a frontal section. You separate the front from the back of the heart, and we look inside. Now the first thing I want you to notice when you're looking inside of the heart is that as I'm looking at this, this side of the heart is on my right as I'm sitting here. If I point to that, I'm pointing to it with my right hand, but it's actually the left side of the heart. And here on my left side is the right side of the heart. And so when you're looking at this picture, it's as if you took that picture and you turned it and you put it inside your body. So in a picture that you're looking straight on at, the left side of the heart is on your right and the right side of the heart is on your left. So, a couple vocabulary words. The first one we have here is the septum, and the septum is some myocardium, some heart muscle, that separates the right and the left sides of the heart. So it divides the right and the left side of the heart, and that's actually really important, and I'll try to show you why in a couple minutes. There's 4 chambers of the heart, and I think probably most of you know that. The 2 chambers at the top of the heart are the atria, or one is called an atrium, and so we call it the right atrium and the left atrium. So these are spaces. You might be familiar with that word atrium. It means entryway. And so the blood is always going to enter from the top of the heart into the atria. And then the 2 lower chambers are the ventricles. So here's the right ventricle and here's the left ventricle. These are the 4 chambers, or the 4 spaces in the heart. There's another picture of probably not live, but an actual heart. It looks a lot like a sheep heart, but I don't know if it is or not. Oh, it says human heart, photo of a human heart, about the size of a sheep heart. I'm used to dissecting sheep hearts for class. But what you see mostly here is muscle, and we call that, again, that's the myocardium. When we're looking inside of the heart, there's also some structures called valves. And there's 2 kinds of valves. This pair of valves are called the atrioventricular valves, the valves that are between the atrium and the ventricle. There's an atrium and a ventricle. You already learned a little bit about valves when we talked about blood vessels, particularly the veins. And hopefully you remember in the veins, the valves prevented the blood from flowing backwards. That's the same thing that the valves in the heart do. They prevent the blood from flowing backwards. Now, notice that there's the 2 atrioventricular valves. So this one's called the right AV, or atrioventricular valve, and the left AV, or atrioventricular valve, right there and there. There's other names for that. This one's also called the mitral valve, and this one's also called the tricuspid valve. Unfortunately, this one's also called the bicuspid valve, but let's see. We'll try to use left atrioventricular valve and mitral valve. Recognize those as the same thing. And right atrioventricular valve, or the tricuspid valve. Okay, so they're going to prevent the blood from flowing backwards. There's another pair of valves that are called the semilunar valves. Now we have one right here, and actually this picture doesn't show the other one very well. It's actually, if I went here, I went underneath there, it's kind of located around the entrance here. I have a picture in the lab book where you can actually see that valve. It's kind of drawn in so you can see it kind of sticking out there. But this valve, again, prevents blood from forming backwards. It's actually called the pulmonary semilunar valve. This valve is called the pulmonary semilunar valve, or you can call it the pulmonary valve. Now, pulmonary refers to lungs, so the blood going through that valve is headed towards the lungs. The valve that's kind of connected into here is called the aortic semilunar valve, or the aortic valve. You can call it the aortic valve too. And that's going to prevent the blood from flowing backwards from the aorta, the big artery. Let's see, what else do we have there? Okay. So the last thing I wanted to talk, or no, not the last thing. I want to mention the concept of the coronary circulation. If you look at the heart itself, you see that there are blood vessels on the surface of the heart. And you can see that here on this one too. And here they're called the cardiac vein and the coronary artery. And these blood vessels are the ones that supply the heart, or the myocardium, the muscle. They supply the heart tissue itself with oxygenated blood and take away deoxygenated blood. So you've heard of people saying they're having a coronary. They're talking about these blood vessels being blocked. Or you might hear somebody say they had a coronary bypass, and that means there was a blockage in one of these vessels providing oxygenated blood to the heart. And so that's referring to these blood vessels. So you don't want these blood vessels to have blockages, or else the heart itself can't function. So here it's talking about the coronary circulation, that the myocardium, the heart muscle, receives oxygen and nutrients from the coronary arteries. This is a really interesting, I won't just read it for you, but the concept of a heart attack versus cardiac arrest. You can look that over. I just thought that was really interesting. Let's see. So here's talking about how the blood circulates through the heart. And this little narration is really the exact same thing. Sorry, all the noises. Lawn mowing right outside my window. This narration that you see right here is describing how the blood passes through the heart. It talks about the vena cava, the largest vein in the body. Also the pulmonary arteries that are the only arteries that carry deoxygenated blood. So the pulmonary arteries are going to carry deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. The pulmonary veins are the only veins in adults that carry oxygenated blood. They're going to carry the blood from the lungs to the heart. So they're going towards the heart, but they're carrying oxygenated blood. And so this whole little all these dots right here, you can follow that through and trace the flow of the blood through the heart. I want you to be able to do that and name the parts on the picture and be able to trace it with your finger. I made a video where I'm talking that through, and it's in the lab book. So you can practice that using that video for both the lecture and the lab. Let's see. Now the last thing I think I'm going to talk about in this section is the cardiac cycle. And when we're talking about the cardiac cycle, we're talking about how the heart beats, the rhythm of the heartbeat, and what's happening there. And so what's going to happen is the deoxygenated blood is coming in on the right side of the heart from the body, from the vena cava. And the oxygenated blood is coming in on the left side of the heart from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. So we look at that. Blood is coming into the right atrium and into the left atrium. And what's going to happen is both the atria are going to contract. Both the chambers at the top are going to contract at the same time, and they're going to push the blood down into the ventricles. And then almost immediately after that, once that starts, and most of the blood is all the way down in the ventricles, then the ventricles are going to contract. Now you can imagine that when the ventricles contract, the valve has to close, or else the blood would be pushed backwards. But also the atria are mostly still contracted. So you have the contraction of the atria, the contraction of the ventricles, and then the whole heart relaxes. So we get bump, bump, relax, bump, bump, relax. And so both the atria are going to contract, then both the ventricles are going to contract, and then the whole heart's going to relax. And you've heard of some of this terminology before. We're saying here, so we call that process the heartbeat. We call that the cardiac cycle. And when all the chambers, when the chambers contract, we call that systole. And when the whole heart relaxes, we call that diastole. And so you guys are probably familiar with the concept of blood pressure. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but it's the ratio of the pressure in the heart, the systolic over the diastolic, the amount of pressure in the heart when the amount of pressure in the arteries when the heart's contracting versus when it's relaxed, systole over diastole. And so that's what this picture is trying to show you. The last thing I wanted to mention is the sounds that people, when a healthcare worker is listening to the heart, your heart in your chest, they're listening for the closing of the valves. And they have sounds that have been described as lub and dub. And it can give you an idea if blood is sloshing backwards when it shouldn't be, because you can hear that. On that note, I'm going to, recommend that you watch this video. I think it's a good video. It shows you that cardiac cycle. And I also recommend that you answer some of the questions at the bottom. Let's see, what did I tell you? Answer questions 1 and 2. Okay, good luck.